Wonderful. Hi, everybody. Welcome on in. We're so excited to have you. My name is Isis Kraus. I am the Chief Strategy Officer at Philanthropy Together. Today's session is going to be incredible. There are 280 of you registered for this Zoom, which I think shows how much you all want to talk about business models in the realm of collaborative philanthropy and what that looks like. And so we're so excited to have a whole crew of folks here get ready to get into that. Philanthropy Together is a field catalyst for collective giving. We are providing the supports and the trainings and the convening power for folks in the collaborative fund universe to get together, to learn together, to be together, to shape their practices better. And we're so excited to be offering monthly sessions like this one for all of you. We've done sessions on messaging around collaborative funds and what's resonating with donors. We've done sessions on MEL practices and how collaboratives can move their work forward that way. So we hope you'll join us. These sessions are monthly, and we'll get started in just a second. I'm going to pass it over to Maya to begin. Thanks, Maya.
Hi all, welcome. Maya Berkowitz, she, her pronouns. I'm the Director of Development at Borealis Philanthropy, and I'm so excited that you all are here with us. I'm going to start sharing my screen, and I'm going to hand it over to Rodney, who's going to start us off.
Great. Thank you, Maya, and welcome everyone. I will just add my excitement that so many folks have registered for this. We think it means that we've hit a nerve on a topic that is of importance to many in the field, and we will take that seriously and also be a little lighthearted as we go through this session. There will be a Q&A at the end. We're aiming for at least 20 minutes, and the recording will be stopped for that. You can see the title of the session. May I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So we are your speakers. We'll introduce ourselves as we go, and we'll go to the next slide, please. So what we're aiming to do today is a few introductions, and then we're going to spend a moment talking about what we think the problem we are aiming to solve is, and that it is a systemic issue. We'll talk about the approach that Borealis and BDO took to addressing this problem for Borealis. The very important hint, process matters. What we learned, we'll talk a bit about, and we'll then allow for some questions and answers. I'll also mention, you may know this already, there is a companion blog post on the Borealis blog written by Amarada Morris and myself that we invite you to take a look at, and there's a resources slide at the end that has a link to it. And may I go to the next slide? By the way, you should also feel free to put questions in the chat as we go, so when we get to the Q&A, our colleagues will have absorbed and organized them for us. So I'm coming to you from BDO USA's nonprofit grant maker and advisory. For those of you who are familiar, we used to be known as Fiscal Management Associates, or FMA. We joined the BDO family a couple of years ago and changed our name to one that tells you exactly what we do. You can see here that we aim to help the sector of nonprofit organizations improve their financial resilience. Nonprofits hire us directly to work with them to do things like help them organize their fiscal team and provide outsourced services. We also do more deep dives into financial models and the like. Funders hire us to help their grantees address their fiscal management challenges, and also hire us to help them with their own understanding of the financial operating needs of their grantee partners so they can be better funders. So that's who we are. And I am on the team as a senior advisor, and I have had a really long career. Among the reasons I'm here is that the team at BDO facilitated a 3-year collaborative with 12 of the largest funders who were trying to answer the question, can project grants no longer be the enemy of nonprofit organizations? How might funders address that? And so that's how we landed in this space. And from here, I'll go to Rana.
Thank you, Rodney. And I too am so excited to be on this call with everybody, not just with the Borealis team, but Rodney was being too humble. Rodney is the fiscal godfather you wish you had in every walk in your nonprofit and philanthropic journey. And I was so inspired by the work that BDO did with the other large foundations that were leading that true cost work, and that which was truly innovative. And we saw this as an opportunity to take it a step further, to be able to really understand what this means for philanthropic intermediaries like Borealis. So I believe that most of y'all know us, but for those of you who do not, Borealis is a social justice philanthropic intermediary. We work across 9 collaborative funds to enhance our collective impact within and between movements across the country. From Black-led movement building to queer and trans liberation to disability justice and inclusion, we build bridges between funders and organizers to upend oppressive systems and support the people most impacted by those systems. And for collaborative funds like ours, and like many of you on this call, we're among the most effective entities for advancing social change. By pooling philanthropic dollars, deepening learning and relationships, and mobilizing resources at the intersection of issues, we hold a necessary and growing role in the philanthropic ecosystem. And as we all know, money can be emotional. Our relationship to it is complicated by both personal and systemic experiences. Whether we come to the work of social justice as grassroots fundraisers or grant makers with large budgets, many of us find it difficult to talk about money within our organizations and within our movements. And so this can make it difficult to truly discern and discuss the business of truly supporting liberatory work. But we cannot get stuck in these difficulties. And at Borealis, we chose not to get stuck in these difficulties. Because while it is rare for intermediaries like ours to consistently be set up for long-term success and sustainability, we're all aware that if Borealis and our peers have felt the tensions of what it means to under-resource infrastructure, then the communities that we serve are likely feeling the impact 100 times. And we can't wait to get it right. The time is now for us to continue sowing the seeds of our immediate future. So as Borealis enters our 10th year of partnering with funders and movement leaders and organizers to build the liberatory future we believe possible, we're leaning more deliberately into our theory of change. We're intentionally investing in this next decade of resourcing justice movements, and we're deepening our efforts to build an infrastructure to really actualize our organizational potential. And this collaboration with Rodney and BDO to develop a new, accurate, and values-driven, emphasis there, values-driven financial model is part of how we intend to do it. So we're thrilled to invite you into this learning space with us, to invite you to join us in wider conversation about tangibly aligning values, practices, and beliefs with the models and structures critical to our existence.
Fantastic, Retta. Thank you. And I'll get over that wonderful thing you said about me eventually. And so with that, we'll hand off to Rebecca and Jean.
Thank you, Rodney, and thank you, Retta. Hello, everyone. I'm Rebecca Luxembourg. I use she, her pronouns. I am the Director of Finance at Borealis Philanthropy, and I am calling in from South Minneapolis on Anishinaabe land. And I am here today to talk about this project. This was something that I think I saw coming for a number of years. If you look, that graph that Retta just showed how Borealis grew by launching new collaborative funds. And we were so busy launching new collaborative funds that we outpaced some of our growth of our own internal infrastructure. So we had a really lean infrastructure. And because we were so busy growing our programs, we hadn't taken the time to really do a thorough analysis of our financial model. So we had an indirect rate that was not covering all of our administrative and infrastructure costs. So saw this coming for a number of years. We knew that we were in a position of a structural deficit that we were kind of plugging with reserve funds and unrestricted net assets. But we knew that we needed to find a sustainable financial solution for Borealis, in part because of that financial problem, but also because we were kind of building our business model as we launched each fund. We had different rates and different allocations across funds. And so as the organization was growing, we were feeling inequities in resource allocation across the funds. So identified that we knew that we needed to do this work, but because we were so busy trying to catch up with our programmatic growth, the time was not right for a long time. So I ended up leaving Borealis during the pandemic. The world changed, Borealis changed. We brought on a new president, Amaretta, who you just met. And then I ended up coming back to Borealis in 2022, in part because it felt like the time was right. Retta had led the organization through a theory of change process. had started this vision of what is one Borealis, where we're working together and not as a series of independent funds, and was also focusing on building the infrastructure. And so I had conversations with Rodney from BDO over the years and said, Rodney, I need your help. Let's do this. Let's kick this off. And the time wasn't right. And then finally in late 2022, it was. So I pulled Rodney in and said, it's now, let's kick this project off. And we also had now on our team, Jean Bell, who I will turn it over to as our board treasurer, who also was a close partner in this work.
Thank you, Rebecca. My name is Jean Bell, she, her pronouns, and I'm ferociously proud to serve on the Borealis board and in support of Retta's leadership and this whole team. And it's exactly as Rebecca stated, the timing was right. And part of what I wanted to bring to this project team and through my role as treasurer was an ethos of curiosity, right? Of not certitude that numbers are one way or another, an ethos of creativity, an ethos of sort of turning over each piece of the work and understanding truly what it's for and who it supports and how it's executed. So that was a lot of the energy I was bringing, that the values and strategies that Retta and the team had landed on, to me, had a clear connection to the business model. And this project was about how do we make that connection and express that connection. So that's kind of the energy I was bringing to it and the hope I was bringing to it. And obviously, could you have a better team than Rodney, BDO, Rebecca, et cetera? Let me bring you in, Rodney.
Thank you, Jean. And so I neglected to say that I use he, him pronouns. Here's a slide that should look familiar to some of us on this call. We have our friends at Bridgespan to thank for giving a name to something that has vexed the sector for a very long time, the starvation cycle. I will invite you to read it on your own and allow me and Jean to speak a little bit to what we've seen in the field. As I said, my team at BDO, we got to lead a collaborative of funders who were attempting to address the starvation cycle. And there's a body of work that was created around project grants need not be the enemy. There's a link on the resources slide for you to learn more. But the important thing just to flag is that this issue is complicated for all nonprofit organizations. It affects some more than others. But really importantly, want to pause and reflect on funder collaboratives. And I think in particular, social justice intermediaries have a particular sort of extra level of challenge here. The fact is, no one wants to waste money on indirect costs, from funders to staff at organizations, to their board members, to the media. No one wants to do that. And the consequence of that is that most organizations under-resource themselves in terms of their infrastructure. But when it comes to social justice intermediaries, one of the things just want to flag, and we'll talk about it a little bit as we go, is that what you have is a group of people who have explicitly agreed that they want to put money on the streets to do good for social justice, which is really urgent and really important, and don't want to spend money on things that aren't putting the money out into the street. And so that was part of the learning for us in this work. Quite confident those of you on the call who are in intermediaries or funder collaboratives in general struggle with this. I just wanted to flag that for the group. And Jean, I'd love to get your perspective on the starvation cycle at this point and how it affects Borealis.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've hit on it. What was really interesting to me about this, having worked and served primarily in intermediaries for the last couple of decades, like you have, is that there is this push-pull of purpose versus really what is the work that we're doing on behalf of constituents. And there is a tendency to want to focus only on the most direct work. And in this case, that is money to movements. But there's a lot of other value being created. And there's a reason that larger philanthropy wants to look to progressive philanthropic intermediaries. And what is that reason? And that reason isn't only embodied by the delivery of a check, right? And so coming to grips with and celebrating all of the value proposition, some of which has not been visibilized at all internally to ourselves through budgeting cycles or through titles, the kinds of things that typically signal a body of work don't always exist, right? We don't have a cost center. We don't have a title, right? Especially in that growth trajectory that Retta and Rebecca just talked about, you're catching up with yourself. And so to even get your arms around all the value you're creating, takes a minute, right? So that's why this kind of a project periodically is so important, right? Because it gets expressed in the dollars, but for intermediaries, there's also this pressure of, can we justify this? Can we justify this, right? Now, general nonprofits have that too, but I think it's a little more straightforward and established. There isn't as much vernacular and sort of shared language for the value beyond the check that intermediaries create. So that's I think a particular nuance to the starvation cycle for intermediaries.
Really appreciate that. And just stating for the record, all nonprofits need to have an appropriate infrastructure to deliver on the mission that we all care about. But that's only part of the story, and we'll talk more about that. Jean, thank you very much. Let's go to the next slide. Rebecca, do you want to talk to us about what our plan was here?
Yeah, and so we kicked this project off in January of 2023. And the slide here has some of what was in the project plan, some of the goals of the project. And if I'm very frank, I think my understanding of the project going in was actually probably a little simplistic. I thought we needed to increase the indirect rate, add more infrastructure, and that was kind of the story. It is a good thing I did not lead this work by myself. I got to hang out with powerhouses Rodney and Jean, but we also formed a design team from folks within the organization to dig into this together. And I think I get to talk a little bit about who they are on the next slide. Yes. Okay. So our design team included Rodney and several of his team members from BDO, Jean, and then we brought team members from Borealis staff across several departments, all of whom touched the money coming into our organization or the money going out of the organization. And so with that group, we were able to really wrestle with different perspectives and challenges related to our business model together. We met 5 times over a period of several months, where we really dug into the data. We looked at our budget and our financial data. We collected feedback from staff across the organization. We also checked in with board members, so we collect a lot of feedback. So we looked at all of that data together. And we had Retta not as a member of our design team, but as a champion of the process and a cheerleader who really helped hold the process, make space for it, and support our work as we moved forward together as a team.
If I may just insert briefly, my colleagues from BDO working on this, I think, are on the call. Sarah Tavkar and Lilia Hoberman, who were fantastic partners. Just want to give them some props.
I think I'll talk a little bit more about the process soon, but we wanted to go to our theory of change next.
And may I speak to this a bit as treasurer? Thank you. So what you're looking at is Borealis's theory of change. Shout out to JDC Partnerships for their help in facilitating the board and staff to get to this content. And I mentioned in my earlier remarks that we believed that these values and strategies not only should, but truly could impact the way we describe the work to ourselves, the way we finance the work, the way we articulate the allocation of resources. And so you can read the values along the bottom, including integrity, interconnectedness, audacity. There's something audacious about describing your work in its fullness and getting paid for it. And healing. And then the strategies have that dotted line around it. And again, I won't read them to you, but this is available, but it's a really agitating, like experimenting, convening a diverse range of partners, and yes, modeling a particular kind of movement-informed fundraising. But what you'll notice is that those strategies, really only one of them is explicitly about writing checks to grassroots activists and movements, not because that's not important, but because what makes that work is the other 3, right? And we wanted to have an explicit and continuous effect on the field of philanthropy and the practices of philanthropy. That's not a secondary outcome for us. It's not a byproduct of the work. It's an intentional design, right? So for us, that agitation and that convening, anyone know how expensive convening is in this day and age? Just that convening, that experimenting, that all costs money, and it's all part of our organizational purpose. It's not a byproduct or a happy accident. So how do we make sure that that work is being captured and resourced? Because again, the field is saying that's what we value about these progressive infrastructure organizations, is they're close to the work, they pull us together, they challenge us, right? Okay, well, that's the role you've asked for. This theory of change expresses it. Now we need to resource it.
Great, well said, Jean, thank you. Rebecca?
Yeah, and I can add to that. I think as a finance director, something I often talk about and think about is that the numbers tell a story. The numbers aren't the story. They tell a story of the work, of the plan for the year. What is the work that we're doing? And so I think just as a work plan is kind of the story that the budget tells in number form, this was really the backbone that we needed to undergird the financial model. We were building a model that told this story in numbers. And so now having this allowed us to create a new model for Borealis.
Great, can we go to the next slide, please?
So I can talk a little bit, sorry, did I cut you off, Rodney?
Go for it.
I can talk a little bit about kind of what we did. I started talking about this before. So we formed this design team. We had a charter of what it was we were trying to accomplish. We looked at our budget. We looked at our financial financial data, our historical financials. We looked at all of the feedback we had collected. And we tried to look at them in a different way. So those of us who sit in finance or accounting are used to looking at our budget or our financial statements cut up by department or program or cost center. And in this project, we tried to step back and think about what is the function of these dollars. These dollars might be sitting in the communications department, but is this advancing our mission? Is this telling the story of the grantees and the movements that we're supporting? Or is this an internal communications cost? So what is the essence of these dollars? And so in doing that, we looked at the numbers in a different way, and a new story kind of started to emerge about how it was that we were spending dollars. And I think I'm going to kick it over to you, Jean, because you were the one who really had the aha moment of this is a new way to look at it.
I think this is the beauty of boards and consultants when they work, is you have that both deep curiosity, but a little bit of detachment, right? And so you're able to say, hey, listen, walks like a duck, talks like a duck. Those are programmatic value creation efforts for the field. And as a beneficiary, a recipient, for instance, of some of Borealis's communications, I can easily tell the difference between when they show us their annual report versus when they're literally sharing lessons from the field about how particular movements are functioning or collaborating, right? So in this work, we have to know enough and have enough confidence and creativity to say, what is this, right? Who's benefiting from this? Why are we doing it? So comms is a great example, right? But what became very clear was that this wasn't just an issue of indirect rate. This was actually an issue of looking at a set of costs that had not been visibilized, therefore that staff were kind of considering just part of the work. And so it's almost the water you're swimming in, right? You're not actually seeing it. And Rebecca mentioned that, like a lot of organizations, the cost centers were pretty traditional, right? They were sort of functional departments, right? But that doesn't always capture what is comms doing and when are they doing it, right? When are program leaders getting together and doing something additional to running their funds, right? This was what we had to get underneath, right? And realize that we actually have a body of work beyond grant making, which is really supporting movements, supporting the leaders in those movements, from convening to capacity building to coaching. And not only do we do that, it's a growing part of our work, because part of the lessons learned from this work is that's what's needed to support grassroots activists and to train and agitate philanthropy on this side, right? So in other words, we really essentially came up with a second body of work that in traditional terms would be seen as programmatic, that needed to be visibilized, resourced, and paid for.
Great. This is the good stuff. And I'll just offer that this was a process that required multiple conversations that were iterative in nature, that we literally had debates. This was not all fun and games. And we had a consensus building process where we used a concept called Fist to Five, where each person got to share what they believe in response to a particular statement that would move the conversation forward or pause it. And we did not always find consensus, and that created more conversation. And so just really making clear that this was not an exercise in numbers. This was an exercise in values and what's important to an institution that aims to be around for the long term. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide. So also in our blog post that Red and I published on Borealis's blog, just want to flag for you, these are the key lessons we kind of lifted up. You can read them as fast as I can, but I will read them aloud because I do think they're important. Experimentation and dreaming required, you've heard us talk about that already, was absolutely true. And I will say we did manage to find fun in this. That's also important. Understanding and accounting for the whole, Jean has just spoken to that really beautifully. Financial models can be living frameworks. This was something that emerged in a really important way. And this project, we'll come back to that in a moment. And this last one, the work can be messy and hard and it's worth it. Cannot be overstated. As I said, this was not always easy. We had general debates. We had some emotional moments, frankly. You know, finance is an emotional issue, as Retta reminds us. Like, we have to be honest about that with ourselves. And so we'll talk a little bit more in the Q&A about that, which sort of hopefully will get people to want to stick around. But let's go ahead and push forward to the next slide. So we talked around it 100 times, but let's pause and reflect. Borealis's financial model, and Jean spoke to this really well, originally had this thing on the left, where you had programs and you had indirect costs. And this, to Rebecca's point, was what we know is that this is not sustainable, that we're not covering those indirect costs well. And what we ended up uncovering, as Jean has described, is what fits into programs, and some of what we had put into indirect actually is best described as movement support services. And to understand that that's a programmatic expense that is necessary for all the reasons that Jean described. And until we named it, we couldn't actually see it or properly resource it. So we've structured the financial model in a way that says much of the money goes to movements, some of the money supports movement support services. And when we did that, the core support services actually were being covered by the stated indirect cost rate. But we also acknowledge that we want that bucket, if you will, to also have room to invest in additional infrastructure and to have reserves. Surpluses lead to reserves that lead to sustainability. If I've learned anything in my 30 years in this field, and it's not widely understood, funders and others want organizations to be sustainable, but yet they structure grants so that every dollar must be spent. So if every dollar must be spent, there's no surplus. And if you don't have a surplus, you can't build reserves and you can't be sustainable. So again, part of the model is to say in that core support services bucket is the intention of having surpluses that can build the reserves of the organization over time to be used as needed to meet the mission, both in times that are good, meaning invest in new things, and times that are challenging to cover costs of when the downturns that naturally will happen. So that's the model at the highest level. Let's go ahead and push to the next slide. Thank you. And Jean actually spoke to this really well. As you know, you'll get these slides. We're not going to go into all the details here, but we decided that we would share with you what we talked about with the full team. And just to underscore what Rebecca said earlier, we met with the full staff early in the process, and then toward the end of the process to make sure that they were being heard and were understanding the journey that we were on. So this was not imposed upon them, super important. And ultimately, we landed at this place where, and again, Jean described this really well, yes, money to movements is the first thing the organization does, but it can't do that in isolation. And all these things that are movement support services, some of them were listed as being indirect costs. For example, the last one, communications that support movement partners and challenge dominant narratives. That's a mission service that the organization is doing in support of their movements. And it was being considered communications, which is considered an indirect cost. So that's one very concrete example. And so this was sort of the framing that we found ourselves coming to with a lot of iteration. When we landed here, we all felt really good about it, though. And I will offer that at no point did any of us say, this is the final model forever and ever on that. We were all very clear that this was an exploration and this was an effort to find something that works well enough for now, worthy of exploration. And as time passes, it may need to get revisited. That was a really important part of this process. I just want to flag for the group. Let's go into the next slide. And yes, please do pop questions into the chat. We would really appreciate those. And this is the other thing. We talked about the sort of the living model. What we decided was, rather than creating firm, rigid percentages that would have dollars allocated to them, we thought about the importance of creating ranges. And the purpose of the ranges is that life changes. That sort of the one constant in life is change is real. And we felt it was really important, given what Borealis does, to acknowledge that explicitly in the financial model. So what you'll see here is the idea is at the beginning of each budget cycle, a look at the financial picture of the organization, the funding environment, the needs of the partners. We will look at, notice I still say we because I'm in it, we'll say, what is the right percentage for this year within money to movements? What's the right percentage for money to movements? And what's the right percentage for core support services, again, including contributions to reserves? And these will change over time. One of the more inspired things that happened in this work was we talked directly to board members about this, who were all really jazzed. In addition, of course, Jean, is the treasurer, but other folks realized that lifting up, like, oh gosh, this is a real opportunity. And we also had the privilege of speaking to a number of the funders of Borealis, who also spoke to recognizing that this was a way of approaching things that had not occurred to them in the course of their work, and saw the real value and really wanted to honor that Borealis is choosing to tell the funders directly that this is what they're doing. And I really want to underscore this, is choosing to share it with the field. That is not a small thing. And I really want to celebrate the Borealis team for wanting to do this. And we really are hopeful that it's going to spark dialogue over time. And so that's sort of what the model is itself. Let's go ahead and push forward. So I'm watching time. So key lessons, we already spoke about this. We just want to remind us that these were the key lessons that we found, and we think we've talked about these well enough for now. We talked about, you can never do no matter how we do this webinar, it's never going to be perfect. So can we go ahead to the next slide? Thank you so much. We want to wrap up offering some questions to you all who are in this room. We are so struck by how many people registered for this, and that so many of you are funder collaborative people, and so many of you are funders. That really speaks to the importance of this question. And so we want to offer these, and these were questions that Retta and I mentioned in the blog post. Really importantly, this is not a Borealis issue. This is a systemic issue and deserves systemic attention. I'll offer here that my colleagues and I at BDO are actually designing right now a research and practice-based project to go deeper on this question of what it means to cover true costs and funder collaboratives. And we invite you to let us know if you're interested in participating in any way. My contact and my colleague John's contact is on the slide at the end. Questions you can read as much as I can. Funders, are you resourcing your funder collaboratives to be strong and effective partners? And part of that is providing annual or periodic general operating support. It's not necessarily enough to say you can use X% of the money that we're giving you to cover your operating costs. It really is that to build these organizations, they need more flexible money. And what I didn't say earlier is that one of the biggest findings of that funder collaborative is that the indirect cost rate of organizations is almost directly aligned with their size. By that, I mean the smallest organizations have the highest indirect cost rates because of economies of scale. They still need to cover all those functions that are in infrastructure, and they might be slightly lower cost than bigger organizations, but as their budget, it's going to be a bigger percentage. And that's really important in this context, because it means that organizations like Borealis will need a higher indirect cost rate than a much larger nonprofit organization will, until they become much larger or not, which is not necessarily their goal, right? Funder collaboratives. Is your financial model aligned with your vision and values? And is it supporting your work and the work of the field? These are critical questions that we want to leave you all with. And with that, I think we get to go to a resources slide. And we're almost on time. Yes, so when you get this deck, each of the purple bars is also a link to the thing that's here. And the one in the middle, Project Grant Still Need Not Be the Enemy, summarizes that collaborative that we had the privilege of working on, as I described, and the resources that flowed from it, which include a tool to calculate indirect cost rate for nonprofit organizations, a great resource on research on how this issue shows up in organizations outside the United States, and other content, including a series of articles. But let's not miss that two funders actually wrote about their own journey in terms of covering indirect costs. And so we wanted to give them a shout out. And as it says here, if you're interested in talking to us more, please do email myself and my colleague, John Summers. Our emails are there. And those of you who are smart enough to recognize the value of Borealis Philanthropy, please feel free to reach out to Maya to learn more about how you can support their work and participate in the work that they do. And that, our friends, is the wrap up for our presentation, which, oh my goodness, we're close to time. Yay. So Maya, I believe you are on task for helping us with Q&A, and I believe we're going to stop recording